Hello, my name is Dr. Christopher Witzel. I'm a professor in sociology, and I have been researching education in Tajikistan for almost 7 or 8 years now. My main interest in Tajikistan is about inequality in education. I began looking at these things in my master's work back in the early 2000s, and was very fortunate to find some great data to be able to look at some of those differences. Then in my dissertation research, I built on that data analysis and included field work that allowed me to visit multiple villages and talk with people about what barriers they faced in sending their children to school. And my original interest in what I call not just privatization, but marketization of the education system came through just some of those interviews when I was basically asking people, what troubles are you facing in sending their children to school? Most of the people, and I would even say all of the people, were saying that finances were the trouble. And I was thinking, well, if this is a free education or government-provided guaranteed education, why is it that school costs keep you from attending school? And especially when I was interviewing in the cities, that's where parents began talking about some of the different informal systems in which they're charged fees, or the fees that they need to attend in order to, or that they need to pay in order to attend various schools. And so that sparked my interest in trying to outline what some of the different levels of education were, and then even begin to match that with the characteristics. Because if there is truly a market, you would think that there's something that people value more in things that maybe would cost more or less. So I wanted to know what those characteristics were that they might have valued more. So this summer I did research on that topic in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, where I would argue is the greatest variety of educational differences in Tajikistan. And coming up in the summer, in this coming summer, I plan on doing some of the same research in Kazakhstan as a comparative project as well. The research that I presented here was an exploratory project, mostly because I don't think enough attention has been called to outlining and mapping what's happening and the choices that parents are making in Central Asian region. Most of us know that there was differentiation in the schools. I greatly appreciated what Dr. Niazov mentioned of that it's not necessarily privatization, but financialization. A lot of the fees that schools are charging initially came from the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapse of the state, the Civil War. A lot of the principals were trying to find ways to survive and for their schools to survive. And funding from the parents was a way to make that happen. So the market or the differentiation between schools was established at that point, and then parents began navigating that. And I think we're just now beginning to map out what those differences are and see how they're working. And in this project, it was great for me because from the context of Tajikistan, I knew that these differences existed. And then now I could look at some of the comparative work to see if the values of what the Tajik families were mentioning matched up with some of the other international literature on that same topic. So I think there will be some unique findings in the Central Asian region. I think it's also interesting to think about what it means in a new setting where parents need to make these decisions. a stereotype of what the Soviet system would have been kind of not as much variation, and less choice and less ability to manipulate those markets. If we actually look at what was available, there were elite schools with better mathematics or humanities education that parents preferred, that they did use networks to access. But now there's a lot more movement of children between and among schools as parents seek out either highly qualified teachers or specific programs, or even particular curriculums. So we had a great discussion before about what is snowball methods and how is it used, and especially in this type of study where I knew that people would be sharing information about informal payments or corruption within their studies. I wanted to start with established contacts. So I've been very fortunate that ever since my dissertation work in 2007, I've been able to return almost on an annual basis with different projects with Open Society Foundations, with UNICEF, and other projects. And so I've remained in contact with some of the families that I interviewed originally during my dissertation work. So those families, which I had known for about 6 to 7 years, comprised a variety of I knew that their children attended a variety of schools, and so I began with them as a core group, and as would be expected, I got some of my most candid responses from them and most open discussions of multiple informal practices, and also in how they chose their schools. Interesting there, as I mentioned in my presentation, that location really played one of the most primary keys, and you could talk to parents about that discussion and other things, even the teachers and some of the informal payments in a more descriptive way than I would have found by approaching strangers. And I knew that because as I built out my sample in a theoretical way, I did begin meeting strangers, and sometimes they would not like to share openly. Sometimes even some of my respondents who I had not known did not like to even compare schools. They like to say all schools have some sort of value and not really mention that. Even when I tried to say, isn't it like a market? Could you say some are better in some areas or worse? Some of the strangers that I was talking to didn't want to think of differentiating schools. So I have the great advantage now that I'm currently working at a university in Kazakhstan, and I thought that it would be a great opportunity to build comparative work. It's always been an interest to me. As I went through graduate school and was thinking about how would I use the comparisons, most of my research has been about Tajikistan and the context in Tajikistan specifically. And I thought, well, perhaps at this time the most valuable thing is to get to know one case very well in depth, so that as I begin to build out and do more of the comparative work, I would have a solid foundation on a single case. And so now that I've built that foundation, I'm now located in another country, and so I'm very much interested in exploring how some of the similar cultures work. There's another sociologist in Central Asia, or a sociologist who works within Central Asia, and he has a great explanation of talking about it as almost an experimental level. If we think about the fact that 25 years ago during the Soviet system, each of the countries would have had the same foundation, that now there have been 20 years in which the countries have selected their own reforms. They have very different financial bases and even different macroeconomic structures. And so you could do some of the comparisons here and think of them almost in an experimental case because of that common foundation they had in the Soviet period. So I'm very interested in seeing in Kazakhstan, which is much more wealthy than Tajikistan, are more of the parents sending their children to their typical neighborhood schools, or are they still trying to access multiple other types of schools, and by what means they're accessing it, and what characteristics do they value? In Tajikistan, for certain, there's a teacher shortage in a lot of the neighborhood schools, and the parents are searching for good quality teachers. And it could be in a lot of the neighborhood schools, they might not necessarily have enough teachers for all of the subjects. And in Kazakhstan, I would be interested to see if that's the same still.